Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Affirming Reflections. If you don't know, my name is Shiloh Rossborough, and my pronouns are he and him. And I'm the Affirming Ministries Coordinator of Edmonton, and my office is based out of the Robertson Wesley United Church, hence why I've been doing these kind of reflections every Monday at noon. So if you're wanting to join, please log in. Hello, Brittany. I see that you joined. How are you doing? Long time no see. And today we're going to reflect a little bit about the Pentecost and the Holy Spirit. So while I start, I just want to see if anyone has any reflections about the Holy Spirit and Pentecost as well. Do you see any queer themes in Pentecost? Do you see any queer themes as well with the Holy Spirit? And if you have any other ideas around that, please feel free to share that in the comments as I talk. I'd love to read those. So today's going to be a pretty short reflection. We're just going to reflect on the verse in Acts that talk about the story of Pentecost. I'll read that out first. So Acts 2, 1-12. The Holy Spirit comes at Pentecost. It states, when the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. Suddenly a sound like the blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. They saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them. Now they were staying in Jerusalem, God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven. When they heard this sound, a crowd came together in bewilderment because each one heard their own language being spoken. Utterly amazed, they asked, aren't all of these who are speaking Galatians? Then how is it that each of us hears them in our own native language? Parthians, Medes, Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt, and parts of Libya near Cyrene, visitors from Rome, both Jews and converts to Judaism, Cretans and Arabs, we hear them declaring the wonders of God in our own tongues. Amazed and perplexed, they asked one another, what does this mean? So that is the story in Acts that talks about Holy Spirit coming at Pentecost. So what is Pentecost? So just a little bit of background of what Pentecost is. If you go back and read parts of the Old Testament, you will discover that Pentecost was actually just one of the Jewish feast days. Only at that time they didn't call it Pentecost. That is the Greek name of this festival. The Jews called it the Feast of Harvest or the Feast of Weeks. And this is because it was a celebration of the beginning of the early weeks of harvest, which was about 50 days after Passover. Pentecost is widely considered the day when Christianity as a movement or as a religion was born. And as told in the book of Acts, as we just read, the story tells us what happened to the disciples of Jesus who were gathered in the upper room following his execution, resurrection, and ascension. The Holy Spirit, or the third person in the Trinity, appeared and divided into tongues, empowering the disciples to proclaim the gospel in the native tongues of people from every nation under heaven who was gathered in Jerusalem. And so essentially Pentecost now, as we know it, is about the Holy Spirit, known as the wind or the breath of God. So what are some affirming reflections? This one, it's easy to queer the Holy Spirit. There's many different ways that we can kind of reflect on the queerness of the Holy Spirit or the queerness of Pentecost in itself. And I'm borrowing some words and terms from Charles Scold and Goodage Cherry. who kind of did their own reflections on queering Pentecost. So I thank them for some of their reflections as well, as I will add these into mine. So for Pentecost, when the Spirit showed up, they became new people. And that is what we learned today from reading Acts. And that is why we celebrate Pentecost. It's on our liturgical calendar. It's the 7th Sunday after Easter. And we know that the Spirit shows up either gently, sometimes it shows up very loud, sometimes the Spirit shows up the way it had before and the way that we've always known it to show up. And other times the Spirit shows up very unexpectedly in a very new or different way than what we were expecting. Brittany states, I mean, the Holy Spirit has no gender technically. Yeah, exactly. That could be a huge theological journey to go through. It's just like talking about the genderless, bodiless understanding of the Holy Spirit, because we see that, God is always seen as the Father, and then we see that Jesus is seen as the Son, which themselves already have gender put in place onto their own beings, yet the Holy Spirit is not. It doesn't have that, although it does often get called He still. There's often times that the Holy Spirit is actually referred to as a female, as it comes from the idea of Sophie, or the wisdom in philosophy is placed onto the spirits. The Spirit usually has this gender fluid understanding in itself, whereas God the Father and Jesus the Son, there's not a lot of wiggle room, whereas the Holy Spirit is genderless, essentially, or all gender, any gender, which is really cool. But I won't be talking a little bit about that today. I'm actually going to say that I'm going to talk about how the Spirit shows up queer. So when the Spirit shows up, the Spirit didn't come with a gender identity, as we were just mentioning. So you can say, in that sense, the Spirit showed up queer. But the way that I want to talk about the Spirit showing up queer is the idea that the Spirit showed up different and unexpected. Some other words in the dictionary for the term queer in a non-LGBTQ sense is this idea that queer means strange, unusual, outlandish, deviant, extraordinary, baffling, mysterious, or perplexing. And this is kind of the history of why queer was used for the LGBTQ community, was because that we were strange and unusual. And so by the words of David Herplin, he writes, queer is by definition whatever is at odds with the normal, the legitimate, or the dominant. There is nothing in particular to which it necessarily refers. It is an identity without an essence. And so I think this beautifully talks about the Holy Spirit in a way, especially in Acts that we just read, in the time of Pentecost, we see that the Holy Spirit shows up in a very strange, unusual, outlandish, deviant, extraordinary, baffling, mysterious, and perplexing way. And so the Spirit shows up queer, essentially. That's how we show up. We show up, we're very, unusual, we're strange, we're, as David mentioned, we are going at odds with what is considered normal or legitimate. Being queer, we're often on the margins, we're often different. And that's what makes us cool, I think. And I think that's what makes the Spirit as well very cool. So Jesus had told the disciples to wait for the Spirit, but they did not know how it would come, or that it would come like that. That they, both men and women, would be the ones prophesying, and in other languages, that the Spirit would move unfamiliar sounds and words from their very own mouths. The Holy Spirit makes people uncomfortable, and that is the point. If you look at, different church denominations like the Pentecostals or the Charismatics, often people who aren't familiar with those denominations will see them as being strange or mad or crazy or more. And they have laid claim to the Spirit, and they have institutionalized, defined, and claimed vocabulary, grammar, and rhetoric for the Spirit, the Holy Spirit. And we have let them. Pentecostals are not uncomfortable with the Holy Spirit at all. They reveal in it. Um, the Holy Spirit births the church, and that Holy Spirit should always make the church uncomfortable, I think. And the reason for this is, remember that the Holy Spirit upends every activity. We're only comfortable in spaces that we are familiar with, or that is normal, or that is, we're only comfortable in spaces that we know. And so if we're going to be thrown into a space where the Holy Spirit completely changes all of that and makes us very, very uncomfortable, right? A lot of people talk about when the disciples received the Holy Spirit in the Pentecost. A lot of people we see later in some of the verses that talks about how they were seen as being drunk, being wild, being all of this stuff. But I would say that no, they were being very, queer. They were being unwieldy. They were being unexpected, bold, even, because something new was being made. Something was gifted, and they were being helped, and something was being done about it. The Holy Spirit queers all beings, in the wind, in the flame, in the flesh, in the water. All of the elements we can see are queered as well through the Holy Spirit. With the water, with baptism, baptizing in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. With the idea of fire, the Holy Spirit came down in tongues of fire. In air, we even see the element of air, with the idea of wind and blowing. And then earth as well. It comes into the flesh, it comes into our earthly bodies. And the idea here is that there's something new being created. And that is the reason for Pentecost. The reason for Pentecost was that it was the start of Christianity. Finally we had God, we had Jesus come and go, and then all we were waiting for was the Holy Spirit. And that was the time and the day that it happened. And so that's why Pentecost is seen as, the start of the movement of Christianity. It's because something new happened. And the reason for that is I kind of relate it back to the story of Stonewall. And many of you probably know a lot about Stonewall. But I imagine the events of Stonewall and Pentecost to be quite similar. The reason for this is because the prompting of the Holy Spirit fell upon the apostles as tongues of fire and sent them out to the streets, as if the Spirit was saying, don't just wait here, do something. And then when Peter left the house and said a message to the crowds later on, to people who are all over the Mediterranean basin, can also be summarized in the same words of don't just stand there, do something. And we see that with Stonewall, we see that with pride parades, we see that with our advocacy, is that we don't just stand here, we do something. Because when we experience the Holy Spirit in a new way, we're moved. We want to change, we want to do something about it. And so for me, I believe that Pentecost celebrates the Holy Spirit as an important aspect of God, and for LGBTQ people, the Spirit inspires change in the church. And I think we should always be striving to be a new people, always be changing, always be wanting to do something more. I'm not sure if anyone else has any reflections. I was asking earlier if you have any first initial thoughts of a queer Holy Spirit, to please share that with me in the comments. We already got one response saying the Holy Spirit has no gender, which is true. I'm sure for many of you, you have seen the Spirit show up as you learn that new language of acceptance for yourself or for others. And that is what the Spirit does. The Spirit gives us a new language. And I want to end off my thoughts by saying the Holy Spirit affirms our humanity, both our individual stories and our collective diversity. When the Spirit shows up, each person is a part of it. There was one spirit, but divided tongues of fire rested on each of them. An affirmation of each person's humanity. We are all connected and intertwined. So let's celebrate that when we enter into Pentecost this Sunday, and into Pride Month in the next few days. We see that, as I said this whole time, as I've been reflecting on it, the Holy Spirit itself isn't queer in the very like LGBTQ sense, but rather it sparks change. It sparks new people. It sparks new language. It sparks what was the other word that I said? Ooh. It initiates change, essentially, inspires change, and I think that is a very queer thing, because as a queer person myself, and as I've seen other queer folks in church, we do the same thing. We inspire change, we inspire new language, we inspire new people. And even if you were with me when I talked about my affirming reflections on the resurrection, queer people themselves, we have this persona that we have, and then once we come out, that old persona dies and is resurrected, and we've become a new person. And I think that this is kind of reflecting on that as well, with the queerness of the Holy Spirit inspiring change and reflecting into a new person that we are. Let's see. Brittany says, could these events involving the LGBTQ2SQ community be present-day representations of Pentecost? Yeah, I would definitely. I would definitely agree with that statement. I think that the Holy Spirit is always guiding us and teaching us to not just stand there and do something. I know for many people, like an easy example would be, you're standing outside and you see, a homeless person who looks hungry, and you're like, oh, like I could definitely go and buy this person a sandwich, or I could just walk away. And you feel that urge, that longing to like do the right thing, yes, but also sometimes you hear that voice in your head saying, go and do it, and you get those butterflies in your stomach. For me, I feel personally that is the Holy Spirit speaking to me. That's how I see it. And so the Holy Spirit always, for me, is never thoughts or feelings, but rather so actions. It's the drive, it's the fire in me that wants me to do something. And I definitely agree that, any of these events, like Pride events that are going to be happening, rallies for us to, ban conversion therapy, which Calgary is hopefully doing today, fingers crossed. Those kind of events, those kind of activities are inspired by the Holy Spirit, I think. And so I would agree, Britt, that those events are essentially Pentecosts, little Pentecosts, because the idea of Pentecost isn't about the festival itself; it's about the Holy Spirit coming into our bodies and inspiring us to make change and to become new people. And I think we do that every day. I think we experience Pentecost every single day, as queer people, as straight people, as anyone. Where we all experience that tongue of fire every single day. As much as it would be really cool to speak a different language, I think that would be really interesting. But unfortunately, I have not experienced that. So that's all I had. I knew today was going to be a really short one. But yeah, reflect on that. Reflect on ways in which the Holy Spirit kind of attacks you and forces you to make changes. Listen to it, listen to what it's trying to tell you, and listen to what it's wanting you to do. And remember the words, don't just stand there, do something. Take care, everyone. Meet me again next Monday at noon. I will be doing another Affirming Reflections. If you have any questions or want to chat throughout the week, I am totally open for that. And stay tuned for some Pride events that are going to be happening. They're just in the works of being planned right now. So I will be making posts of those relatively soon. So take care, everyone. Have a great week. Hopefully it's not as rainy this week. I haven't checked the weather, so we'll pray for that. And I pray for safety and comforts in this time as things are starting to shift and move and reopen. So everyone take care. Have a good day. Have a good week. And I will see you next Monday.